All right, we are recording. Hello, everybody.
Hello,
I am Theo Black.
I'm Sarah Black.
I am a little tired. I've got a morning. I think you haven't slept, so we're doing
Yeah, I'm
great.
a ghoul. I'm officially a ghoul.
Yeah,
It's only so long before I start consuming human flesh. Consuming human flesh.
which
They
may
may
be a
be
talk. Yeah,
consuming human flesh.
there's that you're what's it foreshadowing?
Yeah. Well, it's October, and October is, the horror month because of Halloween, and I like horror a lot, and you like it. I
I
think not
like
as much
horror.
as I do.
Yeah, you're more horror fan than me, but I've been a growing horror fan, so it is one of oh Luna.
Speaking
Uh,
of horror.
Luna Ferratu. Yeah, you're the one who got me
Well,
into horror, and I've been more and more into horror as I've gotten older. So, but you are still the main horror.
Well, and that's what I wanted to. So, we're going to go into talking about a specific horror film because we're going to be watching a specific horror franchise this month, as much of it as we can anyway. Um, but I just wanted to kind of quickly give me your top 3 to 5. And this is quick. So, this isn't like in any kind of order. This isn't necessarily your top. But when you think about like your favorite horror films, what are the first 3 to 5 that come up for you?
Uh,
Again, this is not an official list. This is just what's in your mind right now.
so the Endless pops up on my list. The Thing pops up on my list. Uh, I really like Evil Dead 2, so let's throw it on there. I'm not sure it's my favorite, but why not? It's in the top of the mind. I don't know. Do we count The Lighthouse as
That's
horror?
horror. I would call that horror.
The Lighthouse is one that I really like. Um, I guess that I'll give you four for right now. That's what's coming to mind
Okay.
easily.
It's
Those
interesting.
there's some older ones like I think of Carnival of Souls, and there's also like Aliens,
It's funny too
stuff
though,
like
because one of
that.
the one of the things I've been thinking about that I may end up posting about on our Instagram is the women centricness of horror, and yet everything you picked there was a pretty masculine horror. I mean,
Yeah, no, it is. Well, the first, yeah, and the next two things I think of are Carnival of Souls and Aliens. So those are women, but you're right. The first ones I thought of were, well, Lighthouses has recency
why
bias.
don't you like women,
I
Theo? Why
don't
don't
like
you like women?
fuck women, right? It's bringing to me nothing but pain in my life. No, uh,
Oh no! Terrible.
no, yeah, no, 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 no. Well, I'm even thinking about that because like I really like Aliens, and like further thought, I'd probably put that higher on my list. But yeah, no, like the Lighthouse has recency bias, and the Endless has recency bias. So there's and then the Thing, there's not a woman to be found on
No,
screen anywhere.
no.
So yeah,
I
no, you're
mean,
right. It's
the
interesting.
thing itself is pretty genderless, I think. But
Well, yeah, the Thing is beyond gender, but
yeah, I mean, the ones I was thinking of would be like, and definitely the thing pops up on mine, but I'll do like three or I'll do five that you didn't list, which would be Halloween, The Shining. Um, what would be like my favorite goofy 80s? I mean, Nightmare on Elm Street is pretty fun.
yeah, Nightmare's pretty good.
Um,
I didn't think of Halloween or The Shining. I don't know. Both of those are really good, but The Shining, I don't know if it would be on top of my list.
I
That's
mean,
interesting.
horror is an interesting genre. We're not even touching on something like Rare Exports, which is Christmas comedy horror, if you think about
Yeah,
it.
or Hausu.
House Sue is great. Okay, let's put that on my list for number 4. I was thinking about, I haven't watched Dark Water in a long time, so I can't really put it on my list, but that's another Japanese one.
I liked Under the
Um,
Shadow. It definitely isn't a favorite or anything, but Under the Shadow is like I'm not even sure like how to classify. I mean, I guess that's just like that's almost straight horror, even though it feels like it should be classified differently.
right. And what about something like Thelma? I think that was the Swedish one. That's horror,
Yeah,
right?
I guess, or like it's like horror thriller almost.
Yeah, so I really like horror and I don't know that much about it to talk authoritatively about it, but we are going to talk about a classic of the genre, which is Night of the Living Dead.
Yes.
Do you want to go into that, or is there anything more about the broad
Uh,
genre that you
no,
wanted?
no. Well, I suppose it's interesting because Night of the Living Dead, like you should do the synopsis of it, but it's interesting because Night of the Living Dead is really the start of a new era of horror movies. Well, I'm not a historian, but you
Right,
have
that's where.
you have 30s through 50s, and then like kind of from Psycho and onward, like I feel like Psycho might actually be more the start of it, but from Psycho and onward in the 60s into the 70s and 80s, you really have a horror becoming a different genre, it feels
Yeah.
like horror before that is like monsters. You have so much cat right now. Horror is like a different genre in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Right.
Like
I mean, when I think about the 30s, I think about Fox. Fox
an
survived the
RKO.
Depression, I think, on horror, the classic
Well,
Frankenstein, Dracula.
or isn't RKO some of that too, or am I getting things mixed up?
It could be. I remember it as Fox. I could be wrong. We have not studied this. Yeah, 40s, you start, I think, like Creature from the Black Lagoon. When's
Yeah,
that from?
that's got to be
That's
somewhere in there.
50s. That's 50s. So I'm a
50s.
little bit later.
But like you do get into like beach monsters and that kind of stuff, and you also, I think noirs would, like especially post-war noirs, start to get a little horror-y, like in design, but they're not horrors. They start edging towards that. That almost feels like a precursor to some of what's in the 60s.
Cat People is from the 40s, and the Val Lewton. I understand those are kind of, I don't know. I've listened to Karina Longworth, of You Must Remember This, talk about those, but I don't, from what I remember, they are kind of their own thing, but they are horror.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, and I'm see, like I'm like even trying to think of like, is there not monster horror in 30s, 40s, and 50s? And I'm sure there is, and I know there is.
Frankenstein and Dracula are monster movies. What are you talking about?
No, I'm trying to think. Are there anything besides
monster? Okay, got it.
Yeah, it's like there's there's like Twilight Zone is somewhere in here, but I don't know if maybe that's 60s.
That's later.
Okay,
that's
yeah.
Later.
So like I'm like I don't and I'm sure internationally I know it's a little different like than
and then like what do we count something that's like My Name is Julia Ross, although I think that's later too, which is like psychological horror, gas, I
think that's actually in like the early 40s or something, so it's this area. So it's like, yeah, I mean that's kind of crime or noir, almost, our horror films. I mean,
again, but it's got a psychological angle to it.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I don't know. It's
at some point I'm sure there's some scholarship on it somewhere.
Yeah, but I think it's fun that we've chosen, the Living Dead series, or the Dawn, or the Dead series, not the Evil Deads, but the Night or Dawns or whatever of the Deads, because it's kind of it's like it's spanned many decades, and it is kind of one of the first of I mean, of course, it's popularized zombies, but it also is like certainly like it's right as horror seems to be changing, to me, from my limited knowledge. Anyways.
Yeah. I get what you're saying there. I mean, so it's the late. Okay, let's set it up real quick. So it's 1968, and George Romero directs it, and it is about. They're called ghouls, but they're really zombies, as far as what we know. From what I read, Romero was trying to distinguish them from the Haitian concept of zombies, but they're zombies. I mean, they're zombies.
Right.
They're what we would consider zombies. They show up, they attack a young woman and her brother. The brother seems to get killed. She flees to a farmhouse where Ben shows up. Ben is played by Dwayne Jones, and Barbara is played by Judith O'Dea. And basically, they just hole up in that house, and they're trying to, I guess, survive the night and figure out what to do next, because the zombie attack just happened.
Right. It's like in the process, like she was driving to the cemetery with her brother, and like seemingly it started on that drive.
Right. And so spoilers, these are always full of spoilers.
Yes.
Everyone dies, the end. I mean, not everyone worldwide, but everyone within that house dies.
Yeah.
And that is the basic plot. And so, yeah, it's interesting because you're talking about it as the start of something different.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Like, it's more like, it's because it's like, I guess it's later 80s than I even remembered, because Carnival of Souls is 63, and like that's almost more different than like.
Yeah, but I think Carnival of Souls, I don't think made any money.
it made no money. I've watched some featurettes on it. And it's like it made no money, and it really became popular in retrospect. But it did play drive-ins and stuff, so it did get a release, a very small one, I
Right,
guess.
but it's at actually Dwayne Jones in his in that interview on Criterion that you can listen to said that Night of the Living Dead was one of the last big drive-through movies. I don't know
Yeah.
if he's correct about that, but that's what he said.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's also that like, I mean, so it's like I wonder if we talk about how horror is like a really cheap genre, and like
mhm.
nowadays there's a complaint among filmmakers that I hear regularly where it's like you don't see the mid-budget movies anymore. You either see superhero movies which cost an unfathomable amount of money, or you see a horror film which costs an arm and a leg, which is a lot less in comparison to the rest of it. And it's like so it's like it's interesting, and I wonder if a part of it isn't that like probably it was still cheaper to produce in you know in still cheaper to produce in the studio era in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, I'm sure, because just less sets and all that, and you could probably get off-brand actors. They didn't have to be necessarily famous. But in the 60s, like it's all these low budget seems to lend itself well to the horror genre, so I feel like that might even be a thing too. I don't know. I thought. Did you
Yeah.
did you watch that video essay?
Yeah,
Limitation
the people who did every frame of
frame of
picture
painting, every frame
painting.
of painting. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's
that
on the
makes more sense than every frame is a picture. So I mean,
yes. So yeah, the guys who did that did a video essay that you can find on Criterion Channel. It's called, I think, Limitations into Virtues.
isn't one of um isn't one of those is Taylor Ramos also a guy? The people who did that.
Maybe. I don't know.
Anyway, whoops.
But it's interesting to like see how like I guess we should even talk about the movie. Like we're almost talking too broadly to start. Like if we just talk about the movie, like I like Limitations into Virtues because it sort of explains like why I liked it, which is like there is a consistency of film style, and it seems to just be because these guys were commercial makers,
Right.
and they anything movement was handheld, and static was a tripod, and that was so you can get audio. But they also do some angles, and it's like if things are calm you keep things static, and then you get a handheld shot and hands reach out for Ben. And so there's like some of the filmmaking, like I think is subtly sort of really working, telling a nice little story,
Mm-hmm.
and that works for me. It doesn't change the fact that the story is ultimately a little light.
Yeah, so that's something that like I realized, but it was helpful to watch those documentaries, the two we've been talking about, where it's cheap filmmaking, but it's not poor filmmaking. It's not it's very technically knowledgeable. They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And so, there's a little bit of bad acting in it. Some of the plot is kind of thin, but I think it's 16 millimeter, right? So it just has that grainy look that you get from the smaller film.
Yeah.
But like technically it's very well made. And that's kind of the interesting. I listened to John Carpenter and I think it was Kurt Russell talk about The Thing once, and I think that may have been one of the ones Carpenter had more money to work with, but he made this joke about setting the scene with this big long take, and it's very dramatic and so on, but it's also a low budget thing to do because whenever you see an edit or a cut, you have to do all these different setups. It takes time.
Yeah.
If you set everything, your setup might take a little longer, but if you just do that 1 5-minute shot, 5 minutes is too long. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's time is money. So even though the shot is longer, the amount of work and film and so on that it consumes is smaller. So you're done.
It's especially good to even think of that right now. Like it's good to think about that while thinking of this film, because these guys were working with actual film, and I occasionally forget about film because I'm just watching movies and I don't always think about the technical aspects, and everything's digital now. Even film is often like digital projectors, and all that. And
Mm-hmm.
it is like they had to process the film and they had to cut the film, and there's all, and the actual physical manipulation was more difficult. Low budget back then looked better than low budget right now because it's still a film, and I tend to think even 16 millimeter looks better than like some of this low budget stuff you get now maybe, but it doesn't look digital. But it's so
Yeah,
much easier. It is so much easier to work with digital.
right. I think that's the kind of, there was a barrier to entry with film, which meant in theory people had to know what they were doing at least a little bit to work
Yeah,
with film. Whereas anyone can record stuff with their iPhone. Doesn't mean they're gonna make.
yeah.
I remember I heard someone, was it that, isn't there that reviewer that's like Billy Bob, not Billy Bob Thornton, Joe Bob.
Joe Bob. I don't know who
Something.
Joe Bob is.
It's funny. Joe Bob Briggs. I think it was Joe Bob Briggs. I barely know who this is. But he talked about, he thought that having equipment cost so much less meant you were going to get more good movies because more people would be able to create and you'd get, but instead it's like everybody's running around with an iPhone.
You get more.
Yeah.
I wonder if the percentages change. Like, we don't know what the percentages are. Like, you can't quantitate this, but like how much good versus middling versus bad? Like, what's the percentage? Who knows? But
yeah. And I mean, we're going off of The Dead, but so much of that movie, to me, it's a good movie. It's a good movie, but so much of it is about like the cultural impact, and it has kind of that same story that like Psycho has or Exorcist. Well, does Exorcist have that? So Blair Witch definitely has that story of like this little film, the little film that could. And Psycho was, a Hitchcock film, so it's not like it came out of nowhere, but it was his low budget film, like
Psycho,
put a toilet in it. So
Psycho and Exorcist are both like made by well-known directors, who are working more or less within the studio system, or at least adjacent to it, and like they have some money, and like people are there's both of them have these great shots of people wrapping around the block, and like they didn't have big cineplexes then, so like it was just so many people who wanted to see the movie.
Right, you mean the lines for people seeing
lines
the movie
for people seeing the movie were like around the block, and like there was such a cultural thing about it. They weren't indies, but they were. I mean, The Exorcist probably cost money to some degree. I'm sure it was still more low budget than others, but
yeah.
Whereas like Blair Witch and Night of the Living Dead shifted the culture almost more, like they weren't necessarily wrap around the block like people waiting to see the movie necessarily, though it's like it. Those movies influenced filmmakers and influenced basically the entire setting of horror, and Psycho and The Exorcist did to a degree too. They just did it with a little more money and a little different thing.
And it's also, it feels like with these horror films, there's so much of a story outside the film. Like the marketing, the story of making the film, like like I feel like Titanic, which is not a horror film, has that kind of a story around it, like there are films outside of horror that have those kind of packaging. But I feel like, and actually the funny thing is I see this a little with K-drama where like there's this like hope that maybe the couple on screen is dating in real life and da-da-da. So it has like this bleeding into the real world. But like, you don't like, I don't know. I'd have to like, did people hope that Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks were dating? Like, I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. But like, think about the other genres. Like, Mission Impossible has the thing where Tom Cruise does most of his own stunts. So like, like there's a certain amount of lore that sometimes goes with films, but I feel like horror films often have this like grander, like Blair Witch, is it real or not? Like there's still people out there who supposedly think Blair Witch is real. I don't know. People are kind of funny.
There are people who believe there's a flat earth and conspiracy theories. So
yeah, I mean, someone's always, but it's that kind of a like.
Yeah,
I feel, like Exorcist has this whole story behind it of it, and it's a very visceral genre. And again, we're going broad rather than deep. It's just gonna have to go. But like, I think about horror as like a visceral, like such a. I was talking with our father, and he was talking about how scary some of them were, and it's like I'm not scared by horror like I'm a human being and I can kind of get my adrenaline running if I think about certain horror imagery, but for the most part, like
Yeah.
doesn't really scare me. But it has that visceral quality to it that like a lot of indie art stuff that you and I like is more intellectual, which sounds snobby. It's not how I mean it, but like no one saw
Yeah.
Roma and like I mean someone did. Certainly someone did. But in general, people didn't go to Roma to like feel deep, exciting feelings, you know. It was more about like thinking about these things.
Yeah. I mean, there is always the attempt to make it emotional, I'm sure.
I
I
mean,
mean,
Roma in Roma, there's the scene where she goes into the water, and that really
yeah.
sticks in my mind as a
Oh,
very
yeah.
like. But a
Totally.
lot of that was more quiet and slow and so on.
It's like
Whereas,
it's an adrenaline. People like to go jump out of planes or whatever. It's like that's what
yeah,
horror is, except on a smaller scale, kind of for
yeah,
people to some
yeah.
degree.
I think part of the problem is that also you and I just want to watch more than one of these Living Dead films, and uh, we've only watched one, so there's only so much we can say about it.
Yeah, well, I have two things. One is just a silly one. You know how in Red Letter Media there's like super cuts of Mike talking about Star Trek?
Yeah.
There's going to be a super cut of you somehow talking about K dramas in relation to. I've made this up in my mind.
It's
It's
just on
probably
my mind. It was just an easy thing to think of
no.
quickly.
It's good. This isn't a bad thing. It's just I want to create that super cut in my mind. And then the second is yeah, Night of the Living Dead is it's if I'm trying to get more specific to it, because we're talking about sort of some of the stuff surrounding it. Like it was interesting listening to Dwayne Jones talk about it because I listened to that same thing, and like apparently he doesn't. I don't know. I've only know what's on Criterion. I haven't done a lot of research on this movie, but apparently he didn't give a lot of interviews about it, or didn't really interact with it a lot. He's not
Mm-hmm.
on any of the other stuff in Criterion, and probably there's some interviews with him out there. But like this was right. This was a couple months before he passed away, and
Yeah.
he's basically like it was this thing I did. I had friends. We had a good time doing it. I like those people. It was okay making the film. I don't care about it anymore. I don't care about it that much. I don't think about it that much. It's not really my thing. And I think he was saying something like, they asked him like, have you seen any other of the Dead movies? And he's like, no, but I also haven't seen like a Woody Allen film or like,
Yeah,
so it's
yeah,
like,
that was interesting.
so he's kind of just like, it's almost like he was an actor, but like he wasn't it sounds like he was more like he just wasn't that like he wasn't necessarily like a cinema nerd or anything. Like maybe I'm sure he had a lot of films he liked, but
Yeah.
it was more like he did this thing, he enjoyed it, and then it's sort of he didn't really think about it that much more necessarily. Like it's big in culture, so like it sounded like he was aware of it. It was interesting listening to him talk about it because it's not that he was upset about anything. It's that like he was just a guy and he didn't want anybody to think about him like as if he were just this movie, because to
Right.
him it was a fun thing he did and he's glad you enjoyed it, but it's not all there is to him almost.
Well, do you think there's an issue with horror? To me, I think that rom-coms get the most crap of any genre, but it may be that horror comes next because
Yeah, well, and that I hate it when people separate low into high art and
right.
like genre
But
into
I would say
non-genre.
horror is
But
considered. I wouldn't even say. I'd say horror is considered more lowbrow than rom-coms. I just think people
yeah, and I
are
hate
nastier about
that kind of
rom-com.
thing. And I've heard people talk about it, and I think a lot of modern critics don't do that as much
But
as
I've heard, yes, but I feel like I've heard a lot of actors in particular who felt like they got stuck in horror. And
yeah.
I can't list off names, but there's even like a certain, you either have the actors that are on the horror circuit kind of a thing where they had the one role. I met one of the, because I worked in retail, one of the actresses who was in Friday the 13th, and she was like, to this day, I'm getting fan mail. And she seemed kind of delighted by it. But I think Dwayne Jones took himself very seriously. And
Well, I was listening to the commentary. I didn't finish it. I only got 30 minutes into the film that had George Romero and Jack something, something. The guy who was the producer, I think, on it.
Russo, I think.
Yeah, and some of the other, and there were some other people on it, and I forget who they were.
Well, there's John Russo.
Then maybe that's who I'm thinking of. I think it's John Russo, and there was a Jack in there
Russo,
somewhere.
one of the
yeah.
things.
Yeah, there was a Jack. Anyways, but they were talking about the film, and they mentioned that like originally the guy was going to be, that Ben character was going to be more of a brute, and Dwayne Jones was like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do it this way. And it sounded, the way they talked about it, like they talked like Dwayne, he was a serious actor, and he took himself seriously. And even when he's in the interview, I think that's a part of it, is like he didn't want people to not take him seriously because of the horror film he was in. He just wanted people to treat him, like it was a thing he did, but it wasn't. So like,
right.
And it's also interesting because like he even had trouble in that scene Ben did where he hits Barbara, Barbara slaps him and he hits her back.
Yeah.
And like, I think I kind of actually like that scene, not because I like violence against women. I do not like violence against women.
You said some nasty things about women earlier.
I did, but that's not. I can dislike. No, I don't dislike women. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't. But I like that. Like in this heated moment, like he just is so. Ben's character is so like flustered by the moment that he like hits her back, and then it's immediately like he has an expression of like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, and then she faints, and it's like, well, there's no time that we don't get a moment to like for him to apologize for that. It's that thing where it's like I like that. I like that people think about violence against women in movies, and like there's definitely a discussion about that. I think we sometimes get into this weird place where like you can't depict, like it's that whole issue where like you can't depict a thing, and it's like, well, you should still depict a thing. Like we're not talking Atomic Blonde where it's like an assassin version of an assassin, but like in a like let's be careful how we depict these things. But like it was just nice to see something you don't see on screen very often, and it not be like even the thrust of things. Like if you see violence against women in movies, like it's almost always so intentional and so a part of everything. Like I feel like unless it's an older movie, like in older movies, you see women get slapped around, and that's always a little icky. Yeah. So it's like it's an interesting like random little piece. But Dwayne Jones didn't want to do that, and it's interesting. And I don't know that it fully fits in the movie, but it kind of, I think I like it anyways.
It makes me think about how Alec Guinness seemed always uncomfortable that being such a serious British actor, he was mostly known for being Obi-Wan.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, for me, the other famous thing, I mean, Dwayne Jones was in a few big things, I think, but the other big one that I can think of would be Ganja and Hess. So who knows? Yeah. Do we want to... In part, I pushed this series on you because of the social commentary aspect. Yeah. I'm not sure how deliberate the social commentary in this particular movie is, because from my cursory, and maybe I'll try and watch it with the commentary on just before next week to inform some of the later movies, but he didn't pick Dwayne Jones. He has said he didn't pick Dwayne Jones because he was a black man. He said he just was the best for the part. Women have always been big in horror, and that's an interesting thing to explore. Barbara's not a particularly strong, she's no Ripley.
Ripley.
But it seems like he just wanted to shoot a horror film. Like that was a thing he could do. They were bored with doing commercial films, and he wanted to just do something, so they did a horror film. And any social commentary you can read from it is just kind of a byproduct of it being of its time and some of the interesting choices that he made, but he didn't make them to say anything specific, it seems like.
I in the first 30 minutes, George Romero, it sounds like they did it because they wanted to start making movies, but and they were a film company or a commercial company that made commercials.
Right.
But it sounds like basically people have talked about it being, have talked to George, I think it was him who was talking about it, and maybe also John, just being like, oh, people have said like it was brave for you to make a black man. And George is just like, well, I just cast him because I liked him. Like he's basically like, it wasn't brave. It's not like people are adding all this stuff to it. Like he doesn't want to take credit for it because it wasn't a thing he was doing intentionally, and it's not really a thing to exactly take credit for. But we were talking about this a little bit, before, the other day. It's like the author isn't dead. There's some people who treat work like the author is dead, and I think that's kind of silly. There is an intent behind it. We all love, you and
Right.
me. We're in the middle of the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival,
Yeah.
and we love H.P. Lovecraft work, but we also are aware that he was a flaming racist and not probably
Yeah.
a good person. I mean, wasn't violent or anything as far as we know, but he was probably not a great
Sounds like
person.
he was actually a decent person, but his political views were abhorrent and probably,
Yeah, like he might have been like he's in all these letters, he's nice to people, but like he's also writes these stories and has some really awful things to say about
Yeah, he
anybody who
married.
isn't a white New Englander.
Yeah, it's he. I mean, he's problematic.
Problematic. But so like it's that thing where
I mean, if he were a living author, I probably wouldn't support him. But when you
writes
say the author is dead, you
well,
mean that there's no intent to.
yeah, like it's like you don't want to ignore the intent, but you also don't want to ignore just where it's coming from. Like it's
Right.
interesting to know who's making it, to know where it's coming from. And I don't know enough about George Romero. I want to learn a little bit more about him and what his deal is. So it's like it's not like his like if his intentions were just to make a horror movie, that kind of makes sense, and that adds to the reading of the film. At the same time, things happen, accidents happen. Movies are so many different people working on it, and it's just accidents happen, and so it ends up being a social commentary. And a part of, I think, the issue for me, one of the reasons I don't love it, that I like it, is that like there's some interesting social commentary in there, but it also kind of feels like there isn't social commentary in there. And
Yeah.
that's probably because, having listened to the
Commentary.
audio commentary, and him saying like, well, we just cast Dwayne Jones because he was the best for the role, we liked him. It is like, yeah, they were just guys making a movie, and it turns out that what they made kind of has social commentary in it.
Yeah, it was. Sorry, you have.
Well, and it's just, it's like they were. I think it was Dwayne Jones in the interview who's talking, or somebody, or maybe it was Limitations into Virtues. It was both, talking about how it's like, oh, it's the '60s and how it's tearing itself apart at all this social unrest, and how Dwayne Jones just gets shot at the end, and it's kind of a statement about how black people are treated in the U.S. And it's like, it's all there and it's all interesting. It just and but it is also like, and then there's moments where people are just, I don't know, stuff is just kind of happening and it doesn't feel like it's a fully cohesive piece. So it's like,
Yeah,
that's why it's like, I like it. I don't quite love it because it doesn't quite get
one
there.
of the fascinating things Dwayne Jones mentioned in his interview was he got driven home by a friend of his who was a white woman one night, and some young white kids terrorized him, and even he commented like, I'm in this movie about this imaginary. I mean, this isn't exactly what he said, but basically like, here I am in this movie of horror, but like the real horror is like my experience being a black person in the United States.
Yeah.
So that, that was interesting. But yeah, I mean, that's it. George Romero picked a black man, regardless of what thought he put into it. And that did create something that was interesting.
And the cast and the story sort of lends itself to this like idea of like the 60s pulling itself apart with civil unrest and social unrest. And, we've got our white father character who's a shithead, and, Dwayne Jones, who's kind of this good guy. And like, kind of, you can read into that.
And I think I don't want to talk too much more about it. Maybe we'll go deeper next week after we watch another one or two and even research a little bit more. I think the last thing I want to say is it is interesting how much of this I see in other movies. I mean, I talked about Blair Witch, which mostly has to do with kind of the roughness of it. But then there's things like Signs. There are so many movies with people trapped in the house. And then, this movie has the interesting thing where at certain points, the zombies outside are more dangerous, but at certain point, it's just the other people you're stuck with, which might be one of my more favorite parts of horror in general, is when it kind of goes back and forth where you're not, is the threat really external? I mean, like you think about The Shining, where it's like, is the threat actually external, or is it the fact that our lead character is an alcoholic who's losing his mind? Like, and horror has that, but this has it specifically in the zombie setting. And I can just think of so many movies and books that have that kind of, but I'm not sure that Night of the Living Dead is where it all starts, because there were, you know, he talks about I Am Legend, I think, which is like the zombie novel that came before.
Yeah.
You know, so I suspect, and I told you, I suspect that what he actually did was he like took all the really interesting pieces of those and put it together. He also made it because of space, like it's NASA, like something came from outer space that caused this to happen, which is not
Yeah.
the common zombie lore.
There's actually a clip of the real thing on the Criterion, this Venus space probe or something, and
yeah,
like that he drew inspiration from.
yeah, and that, I mean, zombies are often tied together with like biotechnology, plagues getting free, so on, and the thing from like the Andromeda strain, the thing coming from space and killing people, contagion, like those kind of things are kind of their own genre. So that's a weird intersection. I'm not a huge zombie horror fan, but
Well, I was actually going to say into modern, the way we think of zombies is really more is like pestilence, the fear of disease is where zombies come from. But I think Night of the Living Dead is still close enough to the 50s and 40s. We're not quite, we're not at, it's still pretty deep we're in the era of the Cold War. And so radiation and nuclear bombs and stuff are still heavily on the mind. So radiation coming back from space, you're right, it's an intersection of things. And I think it is kind of this leftover of like, this is Roger Corman and Attack of the Crab People style radiation sort of doing stuff to things. So
crab monsters, not crab people.
Not crab people, crab monsters.
Crabby people just, I'm not happy about this. Get off my lawn.
Yeah. No, so I think you're right. It's an intersection, and I think it's generational.
Like, because I've seen 28 Days Later. Have you seen that? Like,
that's
not, and Walking Dead, isn't that all? It starts with us messing with stuff in labs. Like,
it's most zombies? Yeah, like really, zombies. Like we have actual pandemic movies now, but I think stuff in the 60s and 70s into the 80s, as we start to get into probably more pandemic style movies, like I feel like maybe, and I'd be curious. I need to look at it. I wonder if some of that stuff isn't more like a fear of a pandemic. You know, and like zombies are like like pandemics became an actual movie, and zombies turned into slightly something else, but it's like that, it's similar strain.
Because then there's things like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, like that is from space, and that's almost zombie, but not quite, because the zombie has the flesh-eating aspect, which they hammered in Night of the Living Dead. They had those radio scenes.
I think one of the things is zombies tend to be it's our own fault, and like space horror movies tend to be it's the horror of the unknown, so like that's one of the interesting differences in the genre. And like weirdly, Night of the Living Dead is kind of both somehow. So it's interesting. Anyways, so that
wraps up our broader discussion of horror and our tighter, and we'll get back to the Dead series next week after we watch another one or two of them.
Yeah.